couple of weeks ago, sadly, my wife's grandmother passed away. As hard as that is, she was at that season of life and she was ready to go. So we're also grateful. That also kind of left us with a little bit of a pickle and some hard questions. How were we going to get Amy to the funeral? And what was I going to do with 4 children? If you didn't know, I have 4 children, and sometimes I forget that too. Well, thankfully, some amazing people stepped up and provided some child care, but it was still really quite a bit of a juggle that week, trying to figure out the transportation, the dinner, the extra diapers, and if I'm being honest, there was a moment where it all hit. And all the work that I had put in this past couple months to a healthier schedule, healthier eating habits, even a more restrained internet diet, even a deeper prayer life. It all just kind of went down the tube in minutes. It's amazing how little it takes for things to feel like they are coming apart. And chances are for you, you've felt that too. You felt something really similar at one time or another in your life, but it's not just schedules. It's not just families. It's more than that. It doesn't take much for our sense of stability, personally, culturally, or even as a church to start feeling shaky. And when the church starts to feel shaky, it doesn't usually announce itself in like one big clear moment that we can understand. It shows up in little ways. We feel it in the political noise, in the cultural cross currents, even in conversations inside of the church. We get pulled off center. We start reacting instead of responding. We start leading with what we're against instead of leading with what we're for. And we start talking past one another. And if we're not careful, we slowly drift from being anchored to being anxious. But moments like this, they don't have to fracture us. They can actually refine us. Historically, when the church has faced some of these pressure points, yeah, there's been some negative fallback, but historically, people with open hearts and steady faith, they don't retreat, they actually rise to the occasion. And friends, could we be the kind of church, could we be the kind of people that are counted among that number? Well, today on this Sunday, we're doing something a little bit different. We're going back to the archives and picking up something that we haven't done with our partners or friends at Grace Chapel in a long time. And we're going to do something that they often did in February, and that's reflect on the state of the church. I actually went back to the last time that our friends at Grace Chapel did a State of the Church sermon. And believe it or not, it was all the way back in 2019. Pastor Brian remarked on how it was kind of a difficult season for the church. The church was facing new and challenging questions. And he also remarked that it was a time for change, an optimistic time for change to adapt to the coming challenges that were ahead. And then he joked, at least one thing hasn't changed. The Patriots are still winning Super Bowls. Friends, these are truly the last days. Every generation of the church faces moments that test its center. The question is not whether pressure will come, it's whether we know what actually holds us together when the pressure does come our way. Because when a church loses its center, it doesn't just lose clarity, it loses its witness. New believers lose a picture of mature faith. Families lose a place that feels steady for them. Kids grow up watching tension instead of watching love flourish. The watching world sees just one more divided community instead of a reconciled one. And people who are searching for hope walk away thinking that there must not be anything different here at all. Friends, broken faith, cynical faith, the blame isn't always laid at the front step of the church. At the same time, that kind of thing, it rarely happens in a vacuum. But when the church is healthy, that kind of thing is rare, and it's beautiful. It becomes a place where faith can grow without fear, where hard questions don't fracture relationships, where children see conviction wrapped in kindness, where disagreement doesn't mean division, where people who are weary from the noise of the world can walk out and exhale. And if you're here today and you feel like you're kind of on the outside looking in at the church, even if you're just curious, trying to figure this whole thing out, perhaps you already know this. You already sense this intuitively, that when the church lives and breathes and acts like that, creates that kind of a atmosphere, community, and world, it's actually not just good for the church. It's really good for the world, too. A healthy church becomes a shelter, a lighthouse, not perfect, but steady. And that's why today we need to look at this subject with a clear focus, because today we don't want to just reflect on what this means to me. We want to reflect on what this means to we, which makes the question that we're going to ask really important. How can the church stay centered when outside pressures are hitting it from every direction? That's not a new question. That's actually the reason that Paul, the Apostle Paul, one of the apostles, follower of Jesus who wrote most of the New Testament, was writing to the Colossians in the first place. Now, the Christians in Colossae, they weren't abandoning Jesus. They were trying to deepen their faith. They wanted to grow, to mature, to experience more of God. And that's when it all started. It started with something kind of like a whisper. Yes, Jesus, but also. Yes, faith, but the rules. Yes, grace, but we need those spiritual practices too. Yes, Christ, but we need to think about the other spiritual powers in existence around us as well. If you followed Jesus for any amount of time, chances are that you have heard those whispers too. Maybe not about angel worship or food laws, things like that, but maybe you have heard it in subtler forms. What about this issue? What about this cultural shift? What about that theological debate? And then slowly, without meaning to, your attention gets pulled in a dozen directions. You start wondering what matters most. What deserves your energy? What defines faithfulness? You don't walk away from Jesus. You just start carrying weights that you were never meant to carry in the first place. And when that happens, when faith feels heavier instead of freer, something actually is going on within you. Something is going on within us. Paul could see that in the church at Colossae. And what Paul does next is surprising. He doesn't start with rules. He doesn't debate the arguments. He doesn't give them more spiritual practices. What he does is he actually gives them a hymn, an early hymn, and one that maybe even predates most of the New Testament. He gives them a hymn about Jesus. And I'll be honest, at first glance, this hymn can feel abstract. It can almost feel a little bit overwhelming when we first read it. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He's before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Well, it's not every Sunday that we look at a text that is so dense, and maybe your eyes glazed over for just a minute. That's okay, because this is supposed to feel weighty. It's supposed to be heavy. But here's the question: why does Paul go so big here? Why does it go so huge? These Colossians, they would have understood Jesus. They would have known the stories about Jesus. They would have known him as an amazing teacher. They would have known a Jesus. They would have followed a Jesus who healed bodies, who calmed storms and told parables that made sense of the world. A Jesus who you could actually imagine walking besides. A Jesus you could touch. And maybe that's the kind of Jesus that you first followed too. So why move from a relatable rabbi to language like this? What is Paul actually trying to say here to this church? Well, the hymn turns on two central claims centered on the word firstborn. Firstborn. And the first is this: Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Not meaning he was created, but that he stands over creation. What is he saying? He's saying, if you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. Not just because he models God well, but because he shares in the very activity that belongs to God. When the world came into being, stars, soil, seas, even the unseen powers, Jesus wasn't a spectator in that moment. He was there. He was involved. He was active. Which means this: when Jesus speaks, it's not merely the insight of a wise teacher. It's the voice of the one through whom all things hold together, speaking into the creation he holds together. Second, Paul calls him the head of the body, the firstborn from among the dead. Now, in their world, firstborn language was about rank. It was about standing at the very top, being in front of the line. Now, there were exceptions to this rule. There are exceptions to this rule in the Bible, but in their world, in their thinking, in their logic, the exceptions actually prove the rule. When Jesus was raised from the dead, he wasn't simply brought back to ordinary life, and this is important. He was brought back to the kind of life that the Jews were expecting to receive in eternity, like a body that doesn't break, a body that doesn't get sick, a body that doesn't fracture, that doesn't fall back into death like some of the resurrections that Jesus performed. And here's the consequences. Here's what's at stake. Why this would have been such a significant thing in their world. And we often don't talk about the reasons for the resurrection. But if he was the first to come alive in this body, then he stands at the head, the front of the line, the first of all of the new creation, before Adam, before Caesar, before presidents, before kings. He occupies the special place between God and man first. And that would have said something to them. Lastly, what Paul does in this hymn as he brings it up is he gathers it all up in one word. Did you notice this word too? Does it stand out to you? Because this is probably the most important word in the entire book of Colossians. And it's the word fullness. Fullness. God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell. Paul's not saying that Paul is actually saying that everything that makes life with God right, his goodness, his connection to reality, his joy, his peace, his love, his patience, all of those things, it doesn't just come to Jesus or exist in Jesus. It comes to us through him because of the special place that he occupies. Fullness comes through Jesus, who has the fullness. Not in fragments, not as a supplement, but in fullness. That's a word, when you say it, it almost can't not be felt. Fullness. And because of the cross, because of the reconciliation made through his blood, that fullness wasn't theoretical, it was available. Whatever was happening in Colossae, Paul believed that the starting point was here. No more rules, no more sharper arguments, but access to the fullness of God through a bigger vision of Jesus. Over the past few weeks, I've made a decision that I guess I never expected myself to make. I started putting some hard limits on my exposure to news and social media. Now, is it important to be informed? Yes, it is. Is it good to know what your family members and your friends are doing, what's going on in their lives? Definitely, it is. Is it worth seeing AI videos of Sasquatches talk about their experience? Debatable. A part of me, when I first stepped into this, was saying to myself, you can't do this. It doesn't make sense. It's a part of your job. You need to know about all of the theological debates on YouTube, so if somebody asks you about them, you can be well informed and speak into them. If you don't know what your friends are talking about, then you'll miss the conversation. If you don't know what happened at the Super Bowl, maybe it's good that we don't know what happened at the Super Bowl, right? But on Friday night, I found myself scrolling a newsletter that I subscribed to, and at the bottom, I saw some links to some recent news, and there was a link to an article on the passing of James Van Der Beek. What? James Van Der Beek died? Now, many of you may not know who that is. An actor, a lead actor in the 90s for a heart-throb teen drama called Dawson's Creek. Now, admittedly, I never watched the show, but he was an icon back then, so I recognized who he was, and somebody that's probably not a lot older than I am. And then when I saw the link, I paused and it hit me. I'm like, whoa! I had to stop. It made me think for a moment. Now, there is nothing wrong with being informed, but every time I click something like that, this is what I realized. I was letting something else decide what mattered most in my life, what deserved my attention, and what got to determine how I felt. It wasn't like I was walking away from Jesus in that little moment or in those little moments, but at times I was letting other voices determining the emotional temperature of my life. Churches don't usually walk away from Jesus either. They just let other things define urgency. Last fall, I picked up a novel, a family drama layered in philosophical and relational tension. In one scene, a group of intellectuals and church leaders are arguing about what happens when faith and political power get close to one another. Who defines the boundary? Who absorbs whom? What is the church supposed to become in that moment? it reads like a transcript from our own time. So I had to just do a double take and check the cover, and it was written 200 years ago in Russia. It turns out that these tensions, they're not new. They're not new to us at all. The church wrestling with political questions is not new. The tension trying to follow Jesus in the middle of power and culture, that's not new. What is new is the amount of information that we receive, the velocity and the volume of information pressing all of the time. And the church it's still wrestling with what it means, what faithfulness looks like in this moment. And friends, this tension, it's not absent from Christ Church either. It's not absent from this community. There's a gravitational pull in times like this that tugs at us, and it pulls at us to sort ourselves, to sharpen our edges, to let urgency replace unity. And when that happens, the church starts to drift into corners. That kind of shift, it can feel dramatic and decisive, but history tells us another story. When the church has faced pressures like this before, something often emerges from that moment, not louder, not flashier, but something that is steady, more rooted, more focused on what matters most. And the people who are a part of that kind of church are rarely the loudest in the room. They find themselves to be the most anchored. Well, that's not the only question that can get loud in times of pressure. Politics gets loud, culture gets loud. But another thing that can get loud in the middle of the church is, well, it's money. Money can get loud too. When some look at the future of the church, they predict large churches getting larger and churches like ours disappearing. And just when you think that might be theological, it actually maybe has some roots, maybe has some truth to it. Yeah, as we look at Christ Church and we look at next year's budget, we're finding ourselves saying, well, we overestimated a little bit. We're going to have to do some trimming. Projections haven't quite met expectations, and as we've just reflected on that as leaders, we have determined that some of the generous folks have moved away, have passed away, or are worshiping in other places. That's a part of the normal life cycle of the church. But we're not in a crisis at all. And praise God, we're not in a crisis. But next year is different than 10 years because the church at large has recognized there are generational patterns of giving, and boomers have invested in so many of the structures that we enjoy today. So there are going to be new challenges, and those challenges aren't without consequences. But here is the danger to all of this. Money can start to define urgency too. When resources feel tight, we start asking difficult questions. Well, what can we cut? What must we protect? What do we fight for? What can we let go? And if we're not careful, fear can set the emotional temperature of a church also. This is why Paul goes so big. Because those voices and so many other voices that we could add to this list, they get real loud. And let's be honest, an itinerant preacher who did some miracles and gave some inspirational teaching, that's one thing, but the prophets in the Old Testament, they did the very same things. And the prophets, they didn't change people. Overall, Israel kept going down its path. That's because what feels urgent defines attention. And what defines attention shapes formation. And what shapes formation determines direction. That's why Paul didn't start with a strategy. He didn't write a book, 10 steps to get the church right again. Instead, he starts with a scale. He widens their eyes not to win an argument, not to silence a debate, but to remind them who actually holds all things together. Because when pressure rises, a small Jesus won't hold. The church stays centered in changing tides by choosing the fullness of Christ over the urgency of the moment. By choosing Christ, the fullness of Christ, over the urgency of the moment. And let me tell you why I believe that there are strong signs that that is already happening right here. Over the past few months, it's felt like there's just been more energy and life here in the room. There is more hunger to grow spiritually, to dive into the scriptures. More people are showing up on Sundays. More people are wanting to open the scriptures together. We have more groups than we've ever had before. More people are taking their first steps to serve, and that's not urgency. What that is formation. The church that many of us inherited, it's a blessing, but there's something more going on here. There's something, and this is kind of the crazy thing. When we get the life of God right here, when it's moving in the right motion, when our focus is right, what happens is it starts to spill out and pour out there. Last Thursday, I had the opportunity to meet with the local Amherst CERT team, a team of volunteers who helped us with our massive parking job during Egg Fest. And I came to them and I had to present some new challenges, some difficult things that we had to face with our parking situation. I had my pitch prepared, and afterwards I was kind of ready, we can't do that, or no, it's not going to work this way. But I was amazed at how they gravitated and just came around the issues in support of us. They wanted to be a part of us. They wanted to be a part of serving with us on that day. And that's not the only group of people who've come from the community to serve with us in our events. People from the outside of the community have come to all of our events to serve and to be a part of it. It's amazing. But I noticed something really interesting last month, something that had never happened before. Back in September, we opened up an online prayer list. And we didn't advertise it. It's kind of tucked under one of our menus on the website. But ever since December and January, over a half dozen of the submissions have come from the community. People looking at our website, seeing what we're all about, people who are spiritually hungry. And maybe they're not here today. I didn't know any of them, but they were taking a spiritual step by connecting with us and taking a vulnerable step, asking us to pray with them and to pray for them. That's what fullness looks like. It doesn't just build programs. It builds witness. It spills out into the community. It draws people in who are searching. And personally, I feel like I've really started to discover in a new sense, in a deeper sense, the value of not just thinking about us as a group of individuals who come in on a Sunday morning, but thinking about us as a community, a family that can actually grow together. I'm genuinely hopeful about who we're becoming, not because of momentum, but because I'm starting to see some deeper roots here. And that's exciting. But deeper roots don't mean that we've arrived. Deeper roots mean that we are growing. And one of the clearest indicators of what sits at the center of a church and how it speaks when the temperature rises. Over the past year, the leaders at Christ Church have been having this conversation about communication. What does it look like to communicate in a way that reflects Christ at the center instead of having urgency at the center? When urgency is at the center, speech gets sharp, it gets defensive, It gets reactionary, quick to categorize, quick to assume, quick to protect. When fear is at the center, speech gets anxious. It gets rumor-driven. It gets speculative. When power is at the center, speech gets controlling. It must get out. It must win. It must be heard. But when Christ is at the center, speech slows down. It listens. It clarifies before it corrects. It asks itself if it's the right voice to speak into a situation. It speaks truth without panic. It resists exaggeration. It's careful not to speak just to relieve tension or prove where it stands. It doesn't need to win every moment. And personally, this is an area that I feel like I'm needing to grow in. So just this past week, I searched the Bible for a verse to memorize on speaking. I wanted to find something that was kind of catchy and memorable and would go right for my heart. And I found Proverbs 10:19. When words are many, transgressions are not lacking. But whoever restrains their lips is prudent. Friends, that's not soft. That's anchored. What could this next season at Christ Church be like if we really leaned into that Christ-centered communication? Could we be a community where hard conversations can still happen, but people still walk away feeling filled? Could we be a place where people didn't always agree, but people felt listened to and people felt understood here? Imagine what it would be like to be a part of something that was so different than the outside, that the outside noises no longer had control over us. Not because we are naive, but because Christ was really at the center. And how could we be a gift to the world? By giving it something better to talk about. That, my friends, is a church worth striving for. It's a church that is worth giving ourselves to. It's also the kind of church that we can be when we steady our hearts on Christ and the fullness that God offers through him. It won't be easy. There are other voices that are always going to clamor to be on the top. They're always going to try to sneak their way in. But if we keep returning to the scale that Paul gave us, if we keep widening our eyes to the one who holds everything together, then urgency will not own us. Fear will not define us. Pressure will not fracture us. All of those things instead will prove what is at our center. Let's pray.